Okay, so civil rights, most of this is covered pretty thoroughly in the textbook. The main points from the PowerPoint slides that you would want to be able to deal with on a test, for instance, first of all, equality, the different types of equality. Okay, there are three basic types. Political equality, as it explains, this is this involves equal rights to participate in politics, the equal right to vote, the equal right to run for office. It also, you can also interpret it as including access to education and so on. Okay, so political equality, especially in the context of civil rights, would have mainly to do with the right to vote, the right to participate in politics in a meaningful way. Okay, then there's social equality, which means equal treatment in social life, which can be both public and to some extent private. So this can be restaurants, stores, hotels, movie theaters, things like this. This is the kind of thing where when we talk about civil rights, the ways in which African Americans were denied equality, they were denied political equality by being denied the right to vote, but they were also denied social equality through segregation. Okay, so segregation was largely about denying social equality to African Americans. Then you have economic equality, which means obviously equality in economic matters. And at the end of the slides, there's some discussion about how far the government should go in trying to promote economic equality, different types of policies that can be used to do that. Okay, so these different types of equality, in particular social and political equality. Okay, and as the slides point out, equality is not actually mentioned in the Constitution except in the 14th Amendment. Okay, and we talked about this some in the discussion of civil liberties. The 14th Amendment, the Due Process Clause, the Equal Protection Clause, basically says that no state can deny citizens of the United States. So no state can deny citizens of the national government the rights that they have under the 14th Amendment as citizens of the United States government. Okay, so the 14th Amendment changed things by basically saying that you, every United States citizen, as a citizen of the United States, as a citizen of the national government, has certain fundamental rights and liberties which no individual state can take away. Okay, and so that was the major change of the 14th Amendment, and of course, so that's important, and that it took a long time for that actually to be interpreted. And at first, as the lecture, as the notes talk about, as the textbook talks about, there were some early decisions in the 19th century, civil rights cases in which those parts of the 14th Amendment were interpreted very narrowly. It was only in the 20th century that they were interpreted more expansively to basically make segregation illegal. Okay, but so again, it didn't happen instantly, just like other things we've seen, the Declaration of Independence, the incorporation doctrine, the way that it was based on the 14th Amendment, these ideals of equality are not always realized immediately, but over time they eventually do come to fruition. Okay, so important here, the Civil War amendments. 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. 14th Amendment is often called citizenship. It includes the due process, the equal protection clause. It basically grants to all people, in particular in the historical context, the really important thing was it granted to the freed slaves full citizenship. The 15th Amendment gives all citizens the right to vote, but, and again, the textbook talks about this in detail. There were means that the southern states used to deny the African Americans, the newly freed slaves, the right to vote up until the 1960s, really. Okay? The other major thing, again, most of this should be clear from the book, the major eras or periods or sections or segments of the history of the civil rights struggle. First of all, you have slavery, which goes from the pre-revolutionary period up to, you could say, 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. That didn't free all of the slaves, so you could say not until the passage of the 13th Amendment, but there's slavery, and that's fairly clear. Then there's Reconstruction and resegregation. Reconstruction was an attempt to reconstruct or to basically rebuild Southern society to make it racially equal. And during this time, the South was basically, had of course tried to break away from the North. It had been brought back through military means, and it was basically under military occupation from the North, and it was basically forced to ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So that was part of how they were actually, the Southern states were not allowed to be fully readmitted into the Union until they ratified, and their representatives weren't allowed to have full standing in Congress until they ratified those amendments, okay? That was the period of Reconstruction. It eventually ended, and then you had the period of resegregation, when basically the attempt to create a racially equal society, which had been pushed by the radical Republicans after the Civil War, was basically kind of rolled back by the southern states, and you had segregation. Segregation are laws requiring blacks and whites to be separate in public life, in schools, but also in restaurants, in housing, in all kinds of ways, okay? So that's the period of resegregation. Then you have the civil rights period, which I mean, you could debate when it begins. Let's say it begins roughly after World War II, and it culminates in the Brown v. Board of Education, which was the Supreme Court ruling that said that segregation is unconstitutional, and then in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which were the big legislative achievements that really put an end to segregation and put an end to all of the restrictions on voting rights for African Americans. Okay, so all of this is covered in some detail in the slides, in the book. If there's a question on the test asking you what type of equality did African Americans have at these different stages, slavery, obviously there was no equality. Reconstruction, there was some political equality and maybe a little bit of social equality. With resegregation, legally there was still political equality. Legally, African Americans still had the right to vote, but this was denied through white primaries and poll taxes and literacy tests and all these things that are described in the book. So legally there was political equality, but in reality there was not. Legally, there wasn't social equality at all. Segregation was a legal reality, so clearly there was no social equality. Then in the era of civil rights, finally you get full-fledged actual political equality, both on paper and in reality, and the end of segregation, which then means that you have social equality. As African Americans are actually able to interact as equals in social life, again, restaurants, schools, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the three major stages of the civil rights struggle, and that's how that's what sort of equality existed at each stage. So in case that comes up on a test, you have some idea of what to expect.